of religious thought emphasize the fact that faith communities which exist today, as well as those that are going to be established in the future, because they're always new ones coming to be, often build on what already existed or what exists today. And this is certainly true of the Abrahamic faiths, as they are called, which we will be introducing tonight with Judaism. And we'll also see how Judaism includes certain aspects of paganism, which we learned about last week. So Judaism was established about 4,000 years ago when a gentleman named Abraham, according to the Bible, had an encounter with a divine entity that became known to us as God. In the Bible, there are a number of Hebrew names for God that are based on really the relationship that evolved between the ancestors and early leaders of the Jewish people. The patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, they related to God in the name El Shaddai, which means the God, the one who provides. Later at the burning bush, God revealed God's name as Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. I will be that which I will be, which kind of evolved into a Hebrew with the letters Yud He Vav He, the pronunciation of which was declared only once a year by the high priest on the Holy Day of Atonement in the Holy of Holies. And since the destruction of the temple, the second temple in the year 70, we've really lost that pronunciation. So we use the word Adonai, which means my Lord, or Elohim, the kind of the plural form of God. It often appears in Christian texts as Yahweh, but since that might be the proper pronunciation, even though it really only reflects the consonants and not the vowels, it's only supposed to be said by the high priest, as I said in Yom Kippur. So Jews don't use whatever Yud He Vav He, the name of God, the tetragrammaton that was revealed to Moses at the burning bush. So Abraham and God established this covenant, which basically declared that in exchange for following God's teachings, the descendants of Abraham would become a populous nation and inherit a piece of territory known in the Bible as the Promised Land, and today what we call Israel. And over the centuries, this small nomadic tribe became a large nation, were enslaved in Egypt, were freed by God, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before returning to the land that God had promised in the covenant with Abraham. This, of course, is all described in the book of Genesis and at the beginning of the book of Exodus in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. 7 weeks after the ancient Hebrews left Egypt after 430 years of slavery, God revealed a more extensive covenant at Mount Sinai that came to be known as the Torah, Hebrew for instruction or teaching. This became the first part of the Hebrew Bible, known also as the 5 books of Moses. The essence of those 5 books, particularly chapter 12 of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, basically comprise the majority of the 613 commandments, Hebrew for mitzvot, which form the blueprint for Jewish life. Of those 613, most of them relate to the sacrificial cult, which we no longer do because the temple was destroyed. So today we follow approximately 250 of those commandments. As I mentioned, those commandments are really the blueprint of what Judaism is about, and they've been divided into sort of different categories. Some distinguish them between rituals and moral and ethical commandments. Another way of understanding them is those commandments that impact our relationship with God and those that impact the relationship between us and our fellow human beings. Examples of commandments that are ritual or between us and God include the celebration of the holy days that God commanded and the dietary laws, the laws of kosher, if you're familiar with that. In terms of the holy days, as Dr. Kant taught last week in her presentation on paganism, ancients were very aware of the seasons, particularly as they related to the all-important harvests and the importance of expressing our gratitude for those harvests. So in addition to the day of ram's horn blasts, which today is known as Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Holy Day of Atonement, the biblical holy days are 3 festivals where people are commanded to come to Jerusalem with sacrifices of grain and animals in gratitude for the spring harvest, Passover, the early summer harvest, Shavuot or weeks, and of course the Thanksgiving Horn of Plenty fall, final word of blessing, Sukkot, the holiday, of course, of Sukkot. And these 3 holidays also have historical significance. Passover is the Exodus from Egypt. Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, is the giving of the commandments at Mount Sinai. And Sukkot, the 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, when God provided water and manna to sustain the people. This idea of commemorating historical events inspired later rabbinic leaders to add holidays such as Hanukkah, which commemorates the defeat of the Greeks who tried to establish Hellenism to the Jewish people, and we rededicated after a revolt. We rededicated the temple after it had been defiled. And Purim, which commemorates the saving of the Jews of ancient Persia, whose lives were threatened by a man who sought their destruction because they were different, as described in the book of Esther. The 9th of Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which commemorates the destruction of 2 ancient temples and other calamities during the Middle Ages, and the modern holy days of Holocaust Memorial Day and Israel Independence Day. Examples of commandments between a person and his or her fellow, or moral and ethical teachings, include tithing 10% of your income for the priests, the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, love your neighbor as yourself, and love the stranger in your midst. It's important to relate a major shift in the covenant that is significant to understanding Judaism. From 1000 BCE, when David established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and his son Solomon later built the first temple, to 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, the sacrificial rite was the way we fulfilled one important aspect of the covenant. With the destruction of the temple, the Israelites faced a major challenge. How could they continue maintaining the covenant without sacrifices? In fact, in the ancient Near East, it was the way of the world when one nation conquered another nation that the last act was to go to the temple, kill the priests, and then smash the idol of the god into pieces and declare that the god of the conquering nation was greater than the god of the defeated nation. The members of that defeated nation would see their idol in pieces and then basically assimilate into the conquering nation's way of religious life. Well, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, they headed for the temple to finish off this people and their God. Well, a funny thing happened that day. When they went to the temple, they pulled back the curtain of the Holy of Holies, and guess what? There was no idol of the God of Israel. You probably recall in the second of the 10 Commandments that we're forbidden for making idols, graven images of God. So what were the Babylonians supposed to do? They couldn't tell the Israelites that their God was dead and destroyed. So plan B was to exile the leadership back to Babylonia, and the average person left behind would forget about the ancient covenant. But those leaders took something called the Scroll of the Covenant, mentioned in the second book of Kings, chapter 22, during the Reformation of Josiah, to Babylonia. And because the God of Israel could be anywhere, and our covenant was everlasting, they began to identify the many commandments that they could still observe. 50 years later, when Cyrus conquered Babylonia, the Israelites were allowed to return to Jerusalem, build the second temple, and reestablish the sacrificial rite. Much of Jewish scholarship regards this as the most important event in Jewish history because, based on the custom of the day, Judaism could have ended in 586 BCE had our covenant not been established with an incorporeal, omnipotent, omniscient God. This was the beginning of what today we call Rabbinic Judaism, which technically began in the year 70 CE with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans and continues until today. Because of the constant Jewish rebellions against the Romans after the destruction of the temple, the Romans finally forced the majority of the Jewish population out of Israel. Some were sent north to serve as slaves in Rome. Others fled to Persia, where some Jews who'd been exiled after the first temple had established communities. Others fled to North Africa and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Following the destruction of the temple, some of the commandments needed to be reinterpreted to keep the Jewish people together. Scholarly rabbis met and made decisions. They also introduced formal prayer 3 times a day to replace the 3 daily temple sacrifices. So, one example of how the rabbis reinterpreted Judaism for the time was to look into the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that blueprint for Jewish life, and see what references there might be to what today we call praying to God. And in fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, in Moses' first farewell speech to the people, he declares, "Listen, Israel, God is, Adonai is your God, and Adonai is one," speaking to the monotheistic value of Judaism. Then it goes on to say, "And you shall love Adonai with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I teach you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall speak of them in your home and when you're on the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You should write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates." End quote. So the rabbis interpreted from this verse that you should say the Shema when you lie down and when you rise up, which they interpreted as the morning service and the evening service. And to this day, we say that prayer in the morning and evening services. And we put a little item called a mezuzah on the doorposts of our house, which contains these words that I just read to you and others from the Torah, from the Bible. These proceedings are all found in the Talmud, which was completed in the year 500 CE, and then other rabbinic codes throughout the centuries. During the Middle Ages, these exiled communities lived under the rule of the Catholic Church or Muslim caliphates. Once church doctrine began teaching that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus and that we were a scourge to society, life was pretty difficult for those Jewish communities, mostly in Europe, including forced conversion and murder during the Crusades and Spanish Inquisition, as well as blood libels and other social stigmatizing. Under Muslim rule, based on the teachings that Abraham, Moses, David, and many of the Hebrew Bible characters were part of the monotheistic faith, as well as Muhammad's relationship with the Jewish communities in Mecca and Medina, Jews were a protected minority, and relations between the two communities, Judaism and Islam, were good up until recently in the return of the Jewish people to Palestine in the late 1800s and early 1900s with the so-called Israeli-Arab conflict. In Europe, this changed during the period of Enlightenment when church doctrine and political control was being challenged. After the French Revolution, Jews were accorded citizen status. This began to spread throughout Europe, and some long-held Jewish religious beliefs and practices, like Christianity, went through a reformation. Today, there are 14.7 million Jews worldwide. 5.7 million live in the United States, 6.7 million in Israel, and the rest scattered throughout Europe, Canada, Argentina, Russia, Germany, Australia, South Africa, throughout the world. And today, Jewish identity is defined very broadly since that period of enlightenment. And like Christianity, there are a number of different denominations. In Judaism, these denominations are basically are based on where people are regarding their belief in the revelation at Mount Sinai. Were the commandments in the Torah divinely revealed or inspired to our leaders throughout the ages? The more fundamental approach is followed by the Orthodox, including ultra-Orthodox and Hasidim, who believe that what is described in the 5 books of Moses was revealed by God, and therefore all commandments that we can do, including those that were interpreted by the rabbis over the centuries, must be done. The major progressive movements, known as Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist, believe that the commandments evolved over time in reaction to circumstances. This is often expressed in the phrase tradition and change. A recent movement known as Renewal has integrated meditation and other forms of contemporary spirituality into their prayers and other rituals. So, in the 20 minutes that I had for presentation, this is the beginnings of Judaism and how it's evolved to today. So we now open the floor for any questions, comments, clarifications.
Thank you, Alan. Does anyone have a question? You can ask directly by unmuting yourself, or you can type your question in the chat if you feel more comfortable. Keith, you have your hand raised.
Unmute.
Yeah, you have to unmute.
Yes, you talked about the temple and the importance of the temple and the rites, and so it seems to have been a central part of Jewish life and Jewish religion. Is it still that way? Is there going to be a new temple built? How is that looked upon these days?
Well, needless to say, it depends on the movement. The Orthodox, the most fundamentalist movement, believe that part of a messianic era, and even the concept of Messiah, differs within the different movements. But the Orthodox believe that a temple will be rebuilt, and that all of those sacrificial rites will be reestablished. The more progressive movements do not believe in a reestablishment of the sacrificial rite. Because they view Judaism as evolutionary, they relate to the fact that in the ancient world, when everybody expressed their gratitude or asked for forgiveness to their gods by giving up something, because all anybody had was their food, their grain. So by sacrificing something to the gods or to God, was their way of expressing gratitude. The progressive movements believe that we have evolved and that the temple was destroyed in part because it actually was a failed system. It did not do what it was supposed to do. As often happens with people in power, they become corrupt, and instead of the priests, it was kind of a professor of mine once explained that it had a little bit of corruption built into it, because in order, the more the people sin and have to bring sacrifices, the more that the priests get to eat. So the priests are supposed to tell the people, now you're bringing the sin offering, don't sin anymore. Well, if they tell them not to sin anymore, they don't sin anymore, there'll be less sacrifices. Now, of course, you have other sacrifices besides sin offerings, but those were pretty common, or should have been. So again, the idea in the progressive movements is that Judaism has evolved to the point where we wouldn't go back to sacrificing animals. But the Orthodox do believe that there will be, because it's written in the Torah. 5 books of Moses.
Looks like we have a question in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about the two sons of Abraham and how one's family became the Muslim people and how the other boy's family remained Jewish?
Sure. So when God makes a covenant, God keeps that covenant. And in the ancient Near East, because polygamy was permitted, and most of us on these screens probably know the story. Abraham had a wife named Sarah who could not have children. That's a pretty big problem if your covenant includes that your descendants are going to be as many as the stars in the sky and pebbles of sand on the beach, and you haven't had any children yet, and you're getting along in years. So Sarah, as was common in that day, tells Abraham to take her handmaid Hagar and have a child through Hagar, because in the ancient Near East, of course, it was patrilineal, so it would go through the father, and he was still his son, despite that Sarah wasn't the mother, but his concubine Hagar was her servant, actually, had the child. So Abraham had a son named Ishmael. And then Sarah got pregnant, and he had a son named named Isaac. But because God had promised Abraham's progeny would become a great nation, Ishmael became a great nation as well as Jacob. And the Muslims trace their ancestry to Abraham, but through Ishmael, obviously, not through Jacob. And the Jewish people, the line goes through Isaac and then Jacob and Jacob's 12 sons, which became the 12 tribes, et cetera, et cetera. So the Muslims trace their lineage, again, starting with Abraham, the first monotheist, if you will, and then tracing it through his first son, Ishmael.
We have another question in the chat. I'm curious about the Ark of the Covenant. What was it? What was in it? And where is it, etc.?
So when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, following the Exodus from Egypt on their way to the Promised Land, they built a tabernacle where they sacrificed to God and communicated with God through oracles, etc. And inside that tabernacle, which was obviously it was transported from oasis to oasis during those 40 years, part of that was a holy of holies, where an ark made of gold with cherubs on top. Inside of that were the Ten Commandments. Some believe that both the shards of the first of the Ten Commandments that Moses smashed after he saw the golden calf, and then the second set that God sent him up to get. So they were that's what was contained in what was called the Ark of the Covenant, because it contained the Ten Commandments, which were a representation of the covenant, as I said, the expanded covenant, if you will, given at Mount Sinai. That Ark of the Covenant then was taken into the Promised Land. And if you're familiar with the books of Kings and Samuel, it was generally, before the temple was built, it was taken into battle as kind of an amulet. And as long as you had the Ark of the Covenant with you, God protected you and God delivered you into battle. It doesn't appear all the time. It kind of comes in and out. And it's very mysterious, which why it made such a great prop in Raiders of the Lost Ark, because there's a lot of fascination with it. Biblical scholars believe that it was captured in one of the battles with the Philistines, and knowing that it was an amulet, the Philistines totally destroyed it. And maybe if we're lucky one day, they'll find some remnants of it at the bottom of the Mediterranean, because the Philistines, of course, lived along the Mediterranean coast. No one knows exactly what. Some theorize that because it was in the temple, the Romans took it back to Rome with them after they destroyed the second temple. There's a picture of a candelabra on the ark, Titus's arch, but nothing that represents the destruction of Jerusalem. But it doesn't show anything about the Ark of the Covenant, so it probably didn't exist at that point. Rumor had it that it was in the basement of the Vatican, and rumor also has it that the Israeli CIA, the Mossad, at one point went down, snuck in to see if it was there, and no one's seen it since. So most likely, and that was, who knows how apocryphal that was. And so most scholars believe that it was destroyed during battle in ancient times, biblical times, because it was this amulet that supposedly delivered victory to the Israeli army.
Thank you, Alan. I saw somebody with their hand up a second ago. Did someone want to ask? I think it might have been Jen. Jen, did you want to ask a question? You have to unmute yourself. Jen, are you there?
Feel free to ask any question you ever wanted to know about Judaism, not just the presentation.
You're still muted. Okay, let's take one of the ones in the chat and maybe she can get unmuted by the time we go through that. Let's see. Could you comment on Messianic Judaism and how prevalent it is today?
Yeah, Messianic Judaism, there's two forms of Messianic Judaism. There's a Messianic Judaism that's based mostly in the United States, but in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, it was also known as Jews for Jesus, which basically describes what that form of Messianism is, and that is that that there are Jewish people. I think it still exists. It's not as prevalent as it was. There are Jewish people who believe in their Judaism and follow the practices of Judaism, but they also believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and so they sort of merge some Christianity, certainly a belief in Jesus as Messiah, as Son of God, and their Jewish traditions, their ritual. There was in the 70s, there was an aggressive move on the part of one of the early fundamentalist Christian denominations. I don't recall which one it was at this point, that targeted 40,000 Jews on college campuses to convert to Christianity, to become Jews for Jesus, so to speak. And the Jews for Jesus movement progressed. And it actually was when I got involved in interfaith work, because I came back from my junior year at Hebrew University and I wore my kippah, my skull cap, all the time. And the leaders of this Jews for Jesus movement literally knew my schedule, and they would follow me from class to class and try and convert me. I guess they felt that if they could convert the big Jew on campus, they'd score big points. So they would literally follow me. And so I said, if I'm going to debate these guys, I mean, they were quoting Isaiah 52, of course, and I would just try and explain from the Hebrew perspective that was an interpretation, but it had some flaws to it. And we would debate back and forth. And it finally dawned on me that that possibly just to get them to leave me alone, I needed to kind of come up with an elevator speech, if you will. And I said, as a Jew, I believe that what God revealed at Mount Sinai was God's plan for me. And among those things is, in terms of the laws of kashrut, keeping kosher, you can't mix milk with meat. So I don't eat a cheeseburger. Now, many of my Jewish friends think I'm crazy. Well, that's a law 3,500 years ago. What's the difference whether you have meat with being a, well, I take that on faith, and so I follow it. I can't prove it. And by the way, if there had been a live eye minicam reporter at Mount Sinai, and we captured that and we could show it every year, I guarantee you more Jewish people would keep kosher. So I take that on faith. Now you take on faith that Jesus performed the miracles that Jesus performed, that Jesus resurrected. And had there been a live eye minicam and a reporter at the cave when Jesus resurrected, I guarantee you everybody would believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But there wasn't. So you take that on faith. So I will respect you to take on faith what you take on faith. Please respect me for what I take on. And it kind of ended the conversation. There was like no debate after that. So, and then I came to understand really many religions in that perspective. And that the bottom line for all of our faiths is love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is commentary. Now, and if that's the essence of religion, then what's the difference, who your God is or what your God is, and I'll respect you, and please love me as your neighbor, and I'll love you as my neighbor.
I think Jen might have unmuted herself. Are you there?
Mm. Mm. Okay.
No? Okay.
Hi, I'm there. I'm there. Do you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, well,
Okay.
yes, I just added my question to the comment list.
Yes, we do hear you.
Oh, good. Your
Oh, okay.
voice is
Did you not want to ask it
breaking up a
directly?
bit. I'm on a cell phone, so you're breaking up a bit.
What's your question?
Okay, I
The story in Genesis includes Hagar goes out into the wilderness because Sarah has turned against Hagar, and she goes out fearful with her baby, and she has a conversation with God. And so I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think it's all part of God's promise that Abraham's descendants would become great nations. So God had to, Hagar was protecting. They were out in the hot desert without enough provisions, and she actually put he wasn't a baby at that point, but the child. It doesn't matter how old he was. We don't know how old he was. Put the child away. She couldn't tolerate seeing him die of thirst and hunger. And a miracle was performed, and God provided food for them, which is, again, an indication on my part, and hopefully Jews who read that story carefully, that Ishmael was as entitled to become a great nation as Jacob. I keep saying that, as Isaac, both of whom were the children of Abraham. Does that clarify what you were asking?
Well, without it in the large picture, it's exactly the answer that I was thinking of. But there's also a great encouragement to women who tend to think that Judaism is really patriarchal. Because I like this conversation because as she hears what God says to her, she says herself, you are the God who sees me. And it is a great comfort to people who feel, any people who feel like they've been kicked out of society and that they don't really belong, that in the midst of trouble, she says in faith, you are the God who sees me.
That's a beautiful drosh explanation. And if you talk about feminism, a couple of verses before that, Abraham is distraught. Sarah says, "I want them out of here." And if you studied the Code of Hammurabi and Mesopotamian law, you know that that Sarah was of higher social status because Hagar was her servant. So in terms of the law of the land, Sarah had every right to throw them out, and her son And by the way, there are some stories about Abraham and Sarah going to Egypt and Gerar, and Abraham tells the king that Sarah is his sister in order to protect his skin, because back then, if you saw an attractive woman and she was married, well, that's easy. Just bump off the husband. Now you can marry her. So as Abraham and Sarah were wandering around the area, they were fearful of that. So Abraham tells the king that Sarah is his sister. And the king either has a dream or all of the women become barren overnight somehow, and how they know that I don't know. But the king goes back to Abraham and says, "What have you done to me? You told me she was your sister." And Abraham says, "Well, I did it because I was afraid you'd kill me and take her." But when we read the Code of Hammurabi, we discovered that women of a higher social status had the status of sister wife, which, as we all know, so there were basically three ways that you could, quote unquote, acquire a woman in biblical times. The highest level was called a sister wife. This was a woman whose father didn't need to unload her, so he didn't have to take care of her anymore. She came from a prominent family and he could take care of her. She got married. If she didn't, that's okay. A wife where, again, generally, and polygamy was really permitted in the ancient Near East, and really up until when it was no longer permitted, because a father who could not afford to take care of his daughter was happy to have a man take care of, even if he was already married. So you had the highest status was sister wife, then came wife, and then came concubine. So when Abraham said that Sarah was his sister wife, when he was his sister, he probably said, "Oh, she's my sister wife." He kind of whispered. He emphasized the sister and not the wife part. Probably, we don't know for sure, of course. But so when Sarah says to Abraham, "I want them out of here," Abraham is distraught. This is his son, and God says to Abraham, "Listen to her voice." So that was one of the early feminist or pro-women comments in the Bible. And our rabbis comment that because God said that, Sarah had the status of being a prophetess, because God told Abraham, "You listen to what she's saying." Now, once we discovered the Code of Hammurabi, we understood it a little differently, but nonetheless, but I liked what you had to say as well.
Thank you.
I think we have another hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I would like if you can elaborate or explain the concept of tikkun olam in Judaism.
Tikkun olam is a very popular Hebrew expression today called repair of the world. It has its roots. There's controversy, like there is of anything that's 4,000 years old. But one of the roots of the concept is Jewish mysticism. That when God created the world, it was because of God's greatness. It was hard to create a space for God to make room for God and creating the world. This is all very mystical stuff. So that's why it makes no sense. And in creating the world, the holy vessels exploded and shards were all over the earth. Those shards represent evil in the world, because God is great, God is perfect, God is good. So where does evil come from? And the mystics tell this story about how these vessels that were containing the holiness and good, they broke. Because they just couldn't contain God's greatness and holiness. And those shards represented evil. Tikkun olam, repair of the world, is the idea of going out and collecting those shards so that we can contain them and bring an end to evil in the world. And mystical Jews, Hasidic Jews in particular, certain sects, believe that every time a person does a mitzvah, specifically a Jew, does a mitzvah, a commandment, they are doing tikkun olam. They are repairing the world, and it gets rid of one more evil shard by doing a commandment. So some of you, if some of you have been in a densely populated Jewish area, you may have noticed a sect of Hasidic Jews, men with black beards, dark beards, dark hats, wearing black suit, white shirt with the fringes coming out of their shirt. And they will go up to someone and say, "Are you Jewish?" And if you're Jewish, they'll say, "Have you prayed this morning?" And they actually, in large cities like New York, LA, Chicago, London, they have these RVs. And inside their RVs, they have prayer books and other ritual items. And they'll try and convince, if a person says, "Yes, I'm Jewish," and they'll hang out in Jewish neighborhoods, etc. "Yes, come in." For women to light Sabbath candles and say certain blessings. So they're a little. They're our own version of proselytizers. Oh, by the way, I forgot to to mention the other kind of Messianic Jews, which brought me to it. There's the second Messianic group are Jews living in Israel, predominantly settlers living in what some of us call the West Bank, what they call Shomron, and because they believe that it's biblical Israel, it's part of what was promised God and belongs to the Jewish people, and the Palestinians can live there just as Canaanites lived there in ancient days, or Moabites or the other ancient Canaanite nations, but the land should be given to Israel, they're observant Jews in most cases, but they're more active politically, trying to get the Israeli government and anybody who will help them to annex that land, make it part of Israel, and basically render the impossibility of a Palestinian state. And our current president, who is very close to the Prime Minister of Israel, you may recall a few months ago, told the Israeli Prime Minister that if he wanted to, he could annex. That land was captured by the Israelis in the '67 war and has been, quote unquote, under occupation since that time. Israel has annexed parts of it, East Jerusalem and other areas that were supposed to be part of a land swap during the Oslo Accords in '90s with the Palestinians, the closest we have come to peace with the Palestinians and the establishment of a Palestinian state, but unfortunately it fell apart. But the Messianic Jews living in the West Bank and other parts of Israel believe that land belongs to the Jews, and when the Messiah comes, it will be Israel's. And again, there won't be a Palestinian state.
Okay, it looks like we have several more questions in the chat. The first one's from Valerie. Is it true that in the beginning of the Jewish faith that most of the followers were Black?
No, they were olive skinned. They were Mediterranean, which is darker than European, those of European descent, but they were not Black. The Black Jews are traced to in a treaty between Ethiopia, or Cush as it was known in biblical times, and King Solomon. The Queen of Sheba, another name for it, was given King Solomon as a part of the treaty, and she was Black. And when she had children with King Solomon, those children were Black as well, and that's the origin of African Black Jews. After the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, allegedly those descendants went back to Ethiopia. They did not go to Babylonia because they were Black. They went back to Ethiopia and were basically unknown until there was a communist uprising in the 80s, and some Jews from Ethiopia literally walked to Israel. First of all, they were living in the farm countries, so some of them found out that there is an Israel once again, and they walked to Israel and said, "You have to help get our fellow brothers and sisters out of Ethiopia. We're Jewish, and we need to be brought to Israel." And there was controversy in the beginning because these Jews had been totally cut off, and were basically living almost a biblical life in their villages. The women still had tents where they went when they were menstruating. They still sacrificed on Passover, but they knew nothing about Hanukkah, because that happened after they went back. They knew nothing about Purim. They didn't know anything about the history or condition of Jews living under Muslim countries or under Catholic countries throughout the Middle Ages. So, and basically they were rural farmers, and the Israeli military, when they flew planes into Ethiopia, well, that wasn't into Ethiopia because it was under the communists. They flew planes to a neighboring country. All these Jews literally walked, and when they saw the airplane, they made reference to the Bible, which says that when the Messiah comes, an eagle will fly you, will take you back to Jerusalem. And here, this airplane, which wasn't an eagle, of course, but it looked like an eagle to them, because they'd never seen an airplane before.
Right.
And a friend of mine was on that mission, and they brought cargo planes, no seats. They were handing out prepackaged meals that you get on an airplane. They didn't know how to use a fork and a knife. They'd never seen plastic before. So here you have these people living basically in the 9th century, 10th backwards, dropped into one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, Israel. And how do you integrate them? They've been one of the most challenging of the immigrants to integrate into Israel, but they're slowly making their way. Obviously, they've never seen a computer, much less a tractor. So it's been quite an interesting. But that's what the purpose of Israel is, to save Jews who are. Why some would say Jews need a homeland because of history of anti-Semitism, and if we have a land of our own, then if we are threatened, then we have a place to go.
Unlike African Americans, right?
That's right. That's right. Although I have to tell you, one day I was, this is probably in the 80s, an African American minister came to see me, and he wanted to know all about the kibbutz movement. And he said, I want to, just like the Jews returned to Israel, I want to find a place in Africa, and I want to take my congregation back to Africa, where we came from. And it seems to me that the kibbutz movement would be the best way for us to, just like Israel was rebuilt in the late 80s and early 90s by people coming back to a desolate land by and large. They were able to rebuild through the kibbutz movement, and he wanted to know how to do that. I don't know if he ever did it or not, but it was interesting. It was interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Becky. I have some friends in Pittsburgh who journey as if in the desert and have no temple, but go from temple to temple. Is this a widespread practice or unique to this group?
Well, yes. No, it is not unique. As we know, if you've read any of the Pew studies in the last 20 years on the state of religion in America, the fastest growing denomination that is checked by people who take a survey is none, N-O-N-E at the end. The reaction to organized religion has been heard loudly. And so, and within the Jewish community, We don't have tithing, so most synagogues have to charge dues, and those dues are based on the number of members divided by the budget, which can sometimes be $1,500, $2,000, and A lot of young families can't afford that. B, a lot of people don't see it as a value, and so they synagogue hop, as we say. No synagogue would tell somebody they couldn't come in and pray. You also have, because you don't necessarily need a rabbi or other clergy, there are many knowledgeable Jews, and everything's on the internet now. So anybody who wants to do their own Jewing, if you will, if they create their own Jewish community, some people just want to celebrate holidays. They're not interested in prayer. Some want more contemporary prayers. They can't relate to the Hebrew that they don't understand. And you have a lot of independent folks or people who just kind of jump from synagogue to synagogue and participate. Now with COVID, where most synagogue sanctuaries are closed or very limited, a lot of people are watching online. And this is worrying, of course, many religious institutions. Are people going to come back? On the one hand, when this is over, one of the things that churches and synagogues have discovered is there are a lot of people who are homebound, older people, who didn't have access to their worship service. They've been belonging all those years, and they would continue to pay dues, but they're homebound. So many of them stopped paying and supporting the synagogue because they couldn't participate in services, which is older people they really love doing. So now that they can get it on their computer and it's live streaming, most synagogues have said, we're not going to stop doing this because we've reached people. And so you do have the ability to sort of do your own thing. And if you can't find, you're not satisfied with the worship experience in a particular synagogue, quite frankly, you can just sort of create your own and do it on your own. So it is a phenomenon that we see really growing. And again, it's not just Jewish religion, it's really all established religions.
Okay, the next question, would you talk briefly about social justice in Judaism?
Yeah, so, our Bible, our Torah, our 5 books of Moses contain so many different laws regarding social justice. Obviously, we're all created in the image of God, and we all have God within us. We all come from one Adam, and so that's the number one social issue. Because of our experience, 36 times in the 5 books of Moses, it says you will treat the stranger in your midst properly because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And for those of us in the peace movement, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we remind our more right-wing friends and relatives that we are commanded to treat the stranger. And 22% of the population of Israel, not including the West Bank, are Christians or Muslims. And before, they were Canaanites. I mean, we've always had the stranger in our midst. And so we have a responsibility to treat all people. Love your neighbor as yourself comes from the 19th chapter of the book of Leviticus. A book that's all about sacrifices and what are the priests supposed to wear. It's such a boring book because it doesn't really apply. But right in the middle of that book, which because there's 5 books and that's the 3rd book, the very middle of the whole Torah is all about social justice. If you read chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. Fair measurements, weights. If your friend's donkey has fallen, help the donkey up. I mean, just one law after another, talking about how to treat the other, including the stranger. So social justice, and then you jump ahead, of course, to the whole prophets. The main theme of the prophets was God is not interested in your sacrifices if you are allowing people to go hungry or without clothing. And Micah's famous statement, what does God require of you? To do justice, to love mercy and walk humbly with your God, not keep kosher, not observe the holidays, not the ritual. It's all moral and ethical. So the message within Judaism is very centered, and really the more progressive, the first progressive movement, the Reform movement, really embraced the prophetic teaching over the more ritual, which was not as relevant. And there's really no definition of what is a good Jew, quote unquote. And you have the ultra Orthodox who observe every commandment, particularly the rituals, as we often see in those who think that as long as they are keeping God happy, it doesn't matter how they treat their fellow human being. But that doesn't work in Judaism. You can't be strictly observant of all the rituals and then abuse your spouse or your children, or go into the office on Monday and be inappropriate with your employees. So social justice is really, some would say, the essence of Judaism, and where most of Western civilization gets its mandate for social justice.
It sounds just like humanism to me.
It would work. Oh, absolutely. My father, who did not believe in God, aligned himself. And by the way, there's a Jewish humanist movement. And when you go to their synagogues, when they pray, no mention of God. They pray, because really prayer, when you stop to think about it, prayer in Judaism, it's very true. Prayer, we see prayer as going this direction, not that direction. Prayer is to go inside. Does God need to hear us say all these words? I don't think so. If there's
Correct.
a God, I don't think God needs to hear that. The words we pray are to clean up our act, to make
That's
us
right.
better people.
That's right. That's right.
So you can, humanism. When I used to teach confirmation, those bratty 16-year-olds, of course, invariably a kid would come in the first day of class and say, "This is all a bunch of BS. I don't even believe in God." So I would say, "Sorry, bucko, that does not get you off the hook, because
Has nothing to do with God."
That's right. An argument can be made that you can be an atheist and still be a good Jew. And I know that's hard for many Christians, because in Christianity, belief is everything. In Judaism, behavior is everything. So that's one of the differences.
So we're at about 9 o'clock Eastern right now. So we're coming up on the hour. So I do see there's a request for some recommended reading. When we did the program last week, I sent out a list afterwards. Would you be willing to compile something for?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Nothing would make me happier.
Okay, wonderful. So we will send the recommended reading list out afterwards to everyone who registered. And we'll end with this last question. Do you feel anti-Semitism is on the rise today?
It is indeed, for many reasons. The white supremacists in our midst include some of the old protocols of the elders of Zion, these accusations that Jews control the banks, that Jews control the media, and despite the fact that our president has grandchildren who are Jewish, the vile that is seen on the internet. And of course, there's been a 60% jump in anti-Semitism, shootings in congregation, the 10 Jews who were killed in the Pittsburgh synagogue. So you definitely see a rise in this, because unfortunately, hate is on the rise. And whenever hate is on the rise, Jews are very often accused, because of this history of anti-Semitism and the things that have been said. I mean, even though the Catholic Church in the 60s took out of their doctrine that the Jews are not responsible for killing Jesus, there's still plenty of Jewish kids in schools who experience people calling them Christ killers and putting swastikas on their lockers. So we're living in that kind of a country now and world. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become an excuse for some people to attack. And there's a very fine line. I have a lot of friends who don't love Israel's policies. I don't love Israel's policies, just like I don't love America's policies all the time. But that doesn't make me an anti-Semite. And I have many dear Palestinian friends who aren't very happy with what Israel is doing to their brothers and sisters, but they love me like a brother. So there is a difference, although some people would like to wrap them together. And for some people, they are together, but they are distinct in my mind.
Thank you so much. So, if there aren't any more, are there any last questions or comments before we wrap up from anyone?
And Geneva has my email address. If anybody would like to, didn't get a chance to ask a question, would like to ask me, feel free.
Yes, so I'll send a follow-up email out with Alan's contact information and with the recommended reading. And we will also send out a recording of tonight's program if you want to rewatch it. Is there anything else? Valerie, did you have something?
No, I just wanted to say this, every time I come into these conferences, I come out with a better feeling of this is how I have to approach this, or this is how I have to deal with this. I get a better understanding. But my thing in my head right now is that the reason that we're conflicting is because the lie has been exposed. And so now we have an opportunity to fix the lie, and come out working for humankind as a whole. And I think this is going to be the starting point. I feel a wind of change. So
We can
thank
only
you
hope.
so much.
Yeah,
This
we
is
hope
why
you're right.
This is why Geneva and her organization work so hard to produce these programs and give us all an opportunity to learn and to see how much more we have in common than we have in difference.
Sure. We're all human. We're all human.
Yep.
And if we operate with that first and foremost in mind, we'll be okay. We'll be okay.
A lot of work to do.
Mentioned the shootings in
Yeah. But we start with, what did you say? We start from self. So if you're at peace and if you're happy, then you cannot help but to exude it out and share it with others.
Amen.
Good night, everyone. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Good night all. Stay healthy. Stay healthy, everybody.
Did you have something you were going to say, Keith?
I was just going to mention that Alan mentioned the shootings in Pittsburgh. From a Jewish perspective, why do those kinds of things happen to such good people?
Why do a lot of bad things happen to a lot of good people? It's just there's too much evil in the world, unfortunately, and people justify things in a lot of different ways.
From the Buddhist perspective, it's their karma.
Right.
It was their karma. It was their time. We don't know when our clock is up. We don't know how it's going to come, but death is inevitable. How it comes, we don't know, but it was just their karma. And it was the mystical thing. They were there at that time for that to happen. So you can't figure it out. It's life.
It's still evil.
Yes, but from great evil comes great good, You turn around the evil and make that evil good, changing the poison into medicine,
Gotta work at it. You're right. All right.
Timeless problem of the Odyssey. I don't think we'll ever come to an answer on that one.
Good place to end.
Right. Well,
All right,
thank you.
Good night, all.
Bye. Have a good night.
Thank you all.